Well, you'll recognize some of it. So Terry's a neighbor who I didn't meet till 2014. I would bring your dog back when it wandered down the street. Yeah. All right. So I want to start with what Blessed Solanus Casey taught to calm me down. Have faith in God, shake off excessive worry, and thank God ahead of time. So thank you, God, for how my talk tonight might touch at least one person's heart. So my story is not any Saul on the road to Damascus drama. I've always practiced and loved my Catholic faith, even when it was mostly many years of an immature, more cultural Catholic faith. And I do thank God for it every day. I've always attended Sunday and Holy Day Masses, abstained from meat on Fridays, fasted, but I went years without confession, years without really knowing, with only really knowing about Christ, but not really knowing Him. I've always prayed, but I never really thought in terms of having a relationship with Jesus until 2014, when the Holy Spirit led me to a 7-week program at St. Ignatius, which Deacon Lee and Deb Benson headed up, called Discovering Christ. And that's when Terry and I ended up at the same table, not coincidentally, by God, because, we lived just down the street. And yeah. So leading up to that, about 5 years earlier, we bought our first car with satellite radio, and listening to EWTN station, I discovered Father John Riccardo and his daily program, Christ is the Answer. I would plan my driving time so that I could listen every day. Now you can listen at home on an app, but you couldn't then. And a lot of Father John's homilies and talks are on YouTube. He's no longer a parish priest or a pastor. He's now been tasked by his bishop to evangelize in this amazing way. He's got a ministry called Acts 29. Acts being just 28 books, we're 29. So they have an app, a website, regular emails. If you haven't listened to him, you need to. He has RCIA for Catholics talks on YouTube, because after he was leading RCIA, he realized what we all see is that the new people know a whole lot more than most of the people they sit next to in church once they've become Catholic. So he did do this RCIA for Catholic series, and that made me realize how poorly catechized I was, and he really opened the faith up to me, especially he reads very movingly the I Thirst meditation, which Mother Teresa, St. Teresa of Calcutta, cherished. I was thirsting for more of Jesus and was inspired to buy a new Bible. I hadn't had one since college, which I barely opened after theology classes ended. And I started actually spending time reading the scriptures with Father John, which Father John spoke of. My sister-in-law, who was my best friend, was steeped in the Bible from a very young age. She was, I think, every kind of Protestant that there was. And me going deeper into the Bible strengthened our relationship. She developed ovarian cancer in 2011, and we were much closer then than we had been in the 27 years we had known each other before then. And together we relied on our faith in Jesus to help us negotiate not only the cancer battle, but some difficult family situations we both had going on. For 7.5 years, I was with her for all of it. And in 2018, I basically moved in with her for her last 6 weeks on home hospice care. She often talked with me about how her kids, she had 4 of them, didn't really seem to know Jesus, and she talked about what she should have done, could have done, asked what she could have done. When the 6 weeks that she was dying, Jane's 4 kids, her daughter-in-law, me, her brother, and a dear friend were there practically 24/7. The kids were there 24/7. Jane's Bible was by her bed, and she often asked me or her friend to read aloud some bookmarked passages, which were Philippians 4:4-8, and John 14:1-6. For days, Jane was so weak that she really didn't open her eyes or speak. And in one of her last days, I was by her bed reading John 14, and she joined in, having not spoken for days, saying very clearly, I am the way, the truth, and the life. And her kids were like stunned. I later told her, even though she appeared asleep, I knew that the hearing is the last sense to go. And I told her that all of her kids were here, were deeply affected by her strength of her voice, and that she had just witnessed to them in a powerful, powerful way. I can't say that any of them are practicing any kind of faith, but we're still praying for that. So back up. Prayer was always part of my life, and I always knew that they were powerful. My dad died suddenly in 1989 when I was 30 and a new mom. And the faith he and my mom is what got me through the grief. And it was at Mass that I really still felt so connected to my dad. The rest is going to sound like a medical history, and it kind of is, but it brings me to who I am today. In 2006, our daughter Molly was then 13, and she became very suddenly critically ill. She spent 63 days in the hospital, most of it in the ICU at both University of Maryland and at Hopkins. Her very first nurse at Maryland was Rick's daughter, Mary. And her last nurse at Hopkins was, I don't remember the last name, but Jess, who I reconnected with this past summer at St. Ignatius at a family event that she was at. I recognized her and she recognized me, and it had been 18 or so years since I had seen her. So all through Molly's whole ordeal, I would frequently send email updates to friends, family, Monsignor Jim, the faith formation staff, because I was teaching. I was a catechist there at the time, and I was chronicling the whole roller coaster that we were on, asking for prayers for Molly to be correctly diagnosed and properly treated so that her pain would be relieved and she would fully recover. She was in pain and unable to eat for months, or anyhow, until she was properly treated. She was vomiting bile daily, like not able to eat, and just horrific pain and no diagnosis. Molly would bring her plastic rosary beads that she had from faith formation to every single CAT scan and MRI, and there were at least 13 of those. We had impromptu conversations with the heavily tattooed, gold-toothed young man who was part of the transport team who took her down to radiology for all of those x-rays, CAT scans, and MRIs. And I began to realize he was quietly praying along with me, but at the end of my prayers, he was very loud. In Jesus' name, we pray, every time. And I thought, boy, that was surely a case of you can't judge from what somebody looks like, because he was kind of, at first we thought he was scary looking, but he was a beautiful young man. But then there were times we'd be waiting in the hallway outside radiology, and Molly and I'd be praying, and there'd be people alone on their gurneys who would hear us and would call for me to come down and pray with them, which was surprising, yet not surprising, and really deep. I prayed with the chaplain at daily Mass at Hopkins often, And St. Ignatius was incredible. Monsignor Jim ensured that I had the Eucharist on Easter Sunday morning. Father Isaac Carrour, he he had someone from the office call to see if it was okay to come down to see us, and he really wanted to anoint Molly. And then they were telling me, don't worry, it's not, last rites, and because, I didn't know. And it was beautiful. He was just weeping as he was praying over. She was so sick and looked so awful. And from St. Ignatius, we had like prayers, cards, somebody coming to visit all the time. Monsignor Jim came down to Hopkins multiple times. We got cards from everybody. We got cards and Molly got cards and gifts from people from all over the country that we did not know, who had heard about her from family members. She was on prayer trees all over the U.S. And we felt all those prayers. We felt them all. And throughout all this, it was truly a grace that I was blessed with the confidence and fortitude to research and advocate strongly for Molly with the doctors. I often said to them, I have one patient, you have many, and I'm not here to make friends. I'm here to make sure my daughter's coming home alive with her eyesight intact. All the specialists involved in Molly's care, the neurosurgeon, the ENT, saw what was going on, which was not good. At one point, they had decided, since they couldn't figure out what was wrong with her, it was all in her head, and I, the mom, was enabling it. And it was pretty rotten, because this was a kid who had a ton of friends, loved playing lacrosse. It was that season, and straight A student, loved school, and they were, we had several doctors convinced that it was just in her head. Well, it ended up being in her head, physically in her head. But the specialists involved with her care saw what was going on with the ICU team, and they all gave me their personal cell phone numbers and pager numbers. If they were going to be out of town visiting a family member, they would give me their number, the number of their relative's house, so that I could contact them in case I needed their help advocating for Molly with the ICU team. I know the doctors didn't have the time to do the extensive research I was doing, and I actually learned more about what Molly had once they diagnosed her than they had the time to learn about something that was rare when, they had, like every hospital, they were understaffed and they had a lot going on. But I actually was able to direct her care in a way that seemed to hurt the egos of some of the doctors. And there were some of them that actually horribly mistreated Molly, to the point that if a nurse was in the room, they'd come out crying, and I'd say, what's going on? And they couldn't even look at me. They were crying because of the way one doctor in particular treated Molly. And I know, not to sound boastful, but had I not advocated for her and actually opposed some of what they were trying to do, I'm not sure she would have recovered like she did. We had one incredible ICU attending at Maryland who came in on her day off. She didn't like how her colleagues were dealing with things, and she helped advocate. I had wanted an outside neuro-ophthalmologist to come in and examine her, and they wouldn't do it. And she went to her colleagues and said, you will call him, and you will call him now, because they were trying to put me off, saying, oh, our doctor will be here. He can. And I was like, he's ignored her this long. I'm sorry. He may be great, but I don't have any confidence. Anyhow, the neuro-ophthalmologist did come with that doctor urging them to call him, and he came that night at like 10:30, 11 o'clock at night. He was an Orthodox Jew, and I guess it was after the Sabbath ended. And then first thing the next morning, a Sunday morning, he performed emergency surgery to save Molly's vision. When she had gone almost a month after finally being diagnosed and still not properly treated, Dr. Ben Carson heard of her case and agreed to be her surgeon, and she was transferred to Hopkins. He then implanted a shunt in Molly's spine, which eventually led to her recovery. We knew Dr. Carson was a great surgeon, and we found out he was a man of great faith, too. And all along, like, I knew, as scary as the whole thing was and the whole emotional roller coaster, like, I knew Molly would be okay, but 63 days in the hospital, sleeping on, I brought in a beach chair to sleep in because the hospital little guest chair was terrible. So after Molly was better, we had a follow-up appointment with the neuro-ophthalmologist that we had brought in. And everybody else in the waiting room was at least 60 years older than Molly. And one woman said to me, which at the time I thought was like very bold, she said, "Why is she here? What's the matter with her?" And I told her, and she got up and she came over and she pulled up her sleeve and she showed us her prisoner number from one of the concentration camps. And she said, "Molly, my entire family was killed in the Holocaust. My mother, my father, my sister, everybody I knew. They could kill my family, but they could never kill my spirit. Don't let anyone ever take your spirit, no matter what." And I don't think there was a dry eye in the waiting room. Like, we were deeply touched. Years later, I made an ophthalmology appointment for myself with the ophthalmologist, Dr. Protzko here, who had, through another doctor, given us the name of this neuro-ophthalmologist. And so I went in there for an exam, and I said, "You want to know how I am here and how I knew to come to you?" I said, "You were the one who referred my daughter to Dr. Shalom Kelman, and he saved her vision." And he said, "Oh, I remember that." Nobody who met Molly forgot her. Like, none of the nurses. Years later, when I was with my sister-in-law for chemo, I would see one of the nurses or doctors who had been involved in Molly's care, and they'd get white in the face. "Oh, Mara, why are you here? Where's Molly? Is she okay?" It's like, "Yeah, not here for that." But it just impacted a lot of people. But so Dr. Protzko remembered, and he said, "Well, how is your daughter?" I said, "She's fine. She's great." He's like, "Oh, okay, now I can tell you. The only other patient I knew with anything similar to what Molly had was a young woman in her 30s, and she died." So he had been kind of afraid to ask me how she was. So Molly herself is just a living miracle. She went from 2800 vision, only able to see the big red E on the eye chart, to now she tests at 20/20. And she was told, "Yeah, you may recover some of your eyesight, but you'll never be able to do anything like be a doctor or a nurse or someone who does fine needlework." Well, Molly does fine needlework. She sutures patients. It's been 12 years since her last shunt surgery, and she's now working as a physician assistant, having been inspired by one of Dr. Carson's physician assistants, who, when she was explaining to Molly everything that was going on before one of her surgeries in 2009, Molly said, she was 16 at the time, and she says, "What is your job called?" And she said, "I'm a physician assistant." And Molly didn't know what that was. I really didn't. And she explained it. Molly said, "Okay, that's what I'm going to be. That's what I'm going to be. You connect the brains to the patient, because the brains doesn't do a really good job at that." And, the surgeons have it all up here, but they're not always able to communicate it, nor do they have the time. So Romans 8:28 became my life verse, and Molly's, that God works all things for good for those who love him. So going back to finding Father John Riccardo on the car radio, after listening to him, I started going to weekday Mass again during Lent, something I hadn't done since I was in law school, where it was super easy because the chapel for daily Mass was right across the parking lot. I mean, a driveway from the law school building. But I hadn't done that in years. And until January 2014, I had never missed Sunday Mass, except when Molly was sick in 2006, and she had 4 surgeries on 4 separate Sundays in They don't typically do surgeries on Sunday except out of the ER, so they were all emergency surgeries. But in January 2014, just call it a family situation, had me to the point that I couldn't stop crying. All I did was cry. And ironically, on Holy Family Sunday, I didn't make it to Mass. I emailed Monsignor Jim telling him what was going on, and I said, even though I need Jesus more than ever, I can't stop crying. Like, people will be asking me who died. You know, like, I can't stop crying. And he immediately called me and was just so tender and compassionate, and I did stop crying. But that Lent, I didn't go to a single daily Mass because I was just so sad. But then after a beautiful Easter Sunday Mass, I woke up Monday saying, okay, you didn't go to Mass a single weekday during Lent, but you're going to start now. And that's what I've been doing ever since Easter Monday 2014. So I just resolved not to allow the situation that upset me so much keep me from Jesus, because he was the only one who could give me exactly what I needed. And then it was several months later that the Discovering Christ program was announced at St. Ignatius. And I knew I was thirsting for something, and this program was an enormous blessing. It taught me to embrace the concept, which I really never had even heard of before, of having a relationship with Jesus. Thanks to the program, I experienced adoration for the first time ever. I went to confession for the first time in probably decades. The fellowship and friendships I formed through that program were really life-changing. My faith life, my relationship with Jesus deepened, as did my confidence that Jesus was right there with me, helping me to carry my crosses. That same year, I met Chris Payton at Daily Mass, who is someone who just exudes joy. She always has the most radiant smile, and months after meeting her, I learned that she was a widow and her son was dying of cancer, and I told her, I said, I never would have known you were carrying such heavy crosses. And she said, look, my joy comes from Jesus. It's not going to do me any good to wallow in my sufferings, so I just don't. It was as simple as that, and yet so profound. I realized my mom had done the same, exuded joy after my dad died when she was only 53. I'm one of 10. There were still 2 in college and 1 in high school. So my mom and Chris both inspired me to live more joyfully despite everything that was rotten. 2 years ago, while we were in the Holy Land, a very holy young priest, Father John Rumsa, who we love, right, Mary Beth and Rick? Yeah. Remarked one night that I was such an incredibly joyful person, and I looked at him like, okay. He didn't know what I was dealing with, and I often replay his words in my head, reminding myself that my joy is from the Lord, and I need to be his light to others as often as I can. But am I good at that? No, not always. Most definitely not. I often don't show that joy. Without going into the whole long story, in 2010, I had my own health crisis, and I ended up, after months of, again, nobody knowing what was wrong, an MRI showing that I had a huge mass in my hip, and I ended up, right after I had the CAT scan or MRI that showed it, my oldest had a lacrosse game in New York, and I was on OxyContin, oxycodone, and Lyrica for months because of the pain. And none of that made me loopy, and it kind of helped the pain. But I ended up passing out at her lacrosse game, surrounded by, there were at least 5 dads who were doctors, who had seen me all season, hardly able to walk. But I ended up at Hopkins for 16 days, where what was in my hip turned out to be more than a liter of MRSA. And 16 days in the hospital with practically every med student and doctor at Hopkins coming into the room because the whole thing was so bizarre. And they were saying, "You were part of Grand Rounds today. Did you know that?" I was like, "Is that a good thing? I should, that's where they report on the unusual cases." So then 6 weeks at home. After the 16 days, I was on IV antibiotics. I had a nurse come to the house daily to change my wound dressing because I had an open wound like that in the side of my hip. So OT and PT was coming to the house to help me get back to walking. I'd like to say I had my Bible with me in the hospital and that I prayed my rosary daily, but that would be a lie. And I can say that between Molly's medical journey and mine, including another one in 1998, I developed an appreciation for observant and conscientious nurses, which most of them are, but not all. But they also are overworked, understaffed, and a healthy skepticism of doctors and hospitals. And I would advise everyone to do your own research and never leave a loved one alone in a hospital, ever. So in 2017, I had what I consider to be a miraculous physical healing. In January of that year, I fell and dislocated and shattered my shoulder. I caused severe trauma to the brachial plexus nerve, and my hand was stuck like this. I could do this, but I could not move my hand at all. I had surgery at Hopkins a week after the fall, before which Deb and Lee Benson, my friend Sheila, some other friends from Daily Mass, and Father Isaac Makovo came over to the house to pray with me. Father Isaac anointed me and gave me communion. After the surgery, Ash Wednesday Mass, Monsignor Jim laid a relic of St. Teresa. He didn't tell me what St. Teresa, which one, but laid a relic of St. Teresa on my arm in the sling and prayed, asking Jesus for my healing. And no lie, that same night I went from nothing to 2 fingers being able to move. So I, of course, immediately emailed him saying, "Okay, we're headed in a good direction. Thank you, Father, for your prayers. Thank you, Jesus." I had months of physical therapy after the surgery and hadn't seen much progress, but by the grace of God, 2 friends from Daily Mass who were physical therapists themselves, Patty Amos and Jennifer Young, and another friend, he's now dead, but Tim Smith, I don't know if anybody knows him. He was often in a wheelchair in the back at St. Ignatius, not Daily Mass, but Sunday Mass, because he was a tree guy and got injured in a tree. You probably, yeah. But they were all urging me to switch physical therapists so I could get better treatment. A real God wink is that one of those physical therapists actually, who told me to find somebody else, worked at the first place I was going to, and she saw that they were not doing anything for my hand. They were just working on my shoulder, and she knew, like Tim knew, that I needed serious therapy for my hand. So in May of 2017, I was scheduled for this complex surgery where they were going to take a nerve from my calf and put it up here to try to get my hand moving, because it was, even though I had a little bit in the fingers, the hand was still like frozen. I had had an uncle growing up who had a stroke, and he was stuck like that till the day he died. And it was kind of terrifying. I was crying to the neurosurgeon saying, "I hope to have grandkids one day, and I want to be able to, like, how can I help? How can I hold them? I can't move this hand." And he was like, "Well, if nothing comes back, at least you got this, You could have a hand that moves, but your arm doesn't. So, all right, I'll take it, I guess. But he was going to do this surgery. And when I told the crowd at breakfast after Mass, Debbie Benson immediately said, "Oh no, oh no." And she gathered everybody around and said, "Jesus is still performing miracles, but we're not asking him for them." So she led everybody in prayer, asking Jesus to perform a miracle and heal my hand. And I got my hand back, which then continued getting stronger with the new physical therapist, who was a godsend. I was scheduled for a pre-op appointment with the neurosurgeon, and I went knowing I didn't need the surgery, but I wanted him to see that I didn't need it. And his reaction was, "I'm not going to make any money off of you, but I really don't know how that happened." And I said, "Well, I do, and let me tell you," which I proceeded to tell this wonderful Jewish neurosurgeon exactly about our prayers to Jesus. So family-wise, while our oldest daughter left the church in 2014, which is still painful, the church gained a family member in 2023 when my husband, who had been attending Catholic Mass before we ever met, he started in college. He was raised in the Episcopal Church here. His college offered Sunday services, which were like an ecumenical, evangelical kind of thing, and Catholic Mass. And the Catholic Mass felt much more like what he grew up with at Emmanuel Episcopal. So he actually woke up an hour early every Sunday to go, because the Catholic Mass was at 10, the Protestant one was at 11. But for years, he just wasn't interested in doing RCIA. The 18 years that we were parishioners at St. Ignatius, I asked him, and why? I don't have to. So after things that transpired in 2020 at St. Ignatius regarding the firing of the former youth minister, who I had grown very close to, him, his wife, and his little son, and I worked closely with David. So I was part of the middle school program and helped out with the high school youth group and chaperoned the high school youth group to a retreat that was life-changing for every one of us. Two of the young men who were on that retreat are now in the seminary, Ben and Mark Bogner, great young men. But after David was fired, and then multiple things, I would say like COVID response related in 2021, I didn't feel like I could be part of St. Ignatius anymore, and I didn't think they would allow me to be a catechist anymore, since they knew I knew everything that had gone down with David, who was basically fired for teaching the truth, which people don't like to hear. So we joined. It was really, really hard, and I was like really just full of so much sorrow, because Monsignor Jim had done so much for me and my family, but I felt like I had to leave. And we came to St. Margaret's, where Father Michael Rubling and Father Matt DeFusco were serving. I had first met Father Michael when he was a seminarian doing his seminarian year at St. Ignatius, and we bonded over both being the oldest of 10. And it turned out a priest that I knew from my mom's church, the church I grew up in New York, was Father Michael's roommate when he was at the North American College in Rome. So after Father Michael's ordination, we had kept in touch via email. And so coming to St. Margaret's and seeing him, and that was when we were all wearing masks. I hadn't seen him since when he was ordained a deacon, because when his priesthood ordination, I ended up with an emergency for my mom, unable to go. But I went up to greet him, had this stupid mask on, and he says, "Mara," and I was like, "You remember me?" And he said, "Of course I do," and gave me a big hug. I asked if it was okay to take the mask off, and he said, "Yeah, this is obedience, not that I'm afraid of you." But Father Michael and Father Matt saw me crying almost every morning at daily Mass. So we were then estranged from our oldest daughter until one morning after Mass, December 2021, I was helping untangle the Christmas lights that were going to go up in church. And during Mass, I realized, and Father Michael was sitting next to me doing the lights, and I said, no, I'm not crying anymore. My joy is in Jesus alone. I'm no longer going to cry about my daughter. I know he loves her even more than I do. Father Michael and Father Matt were exactly the priests I needed to help me cope. And Father Matt ministered to me in such an incredible way, enabling me to help Molly get through nothing physical, but incredibly, well, kind of physical. It was, anyhow, a very, very difficult and scary situation in 2021 and 2022. And then with Father Michael leading the RCIA program here at St. Margaret's, Rich said, yeah, I'll do it. So he did. After the Easter Vigil, we invited Father Michael to Papa's with us for dinner. And he sits down next to me. He says, Mary, do you remember the very first thing you said to me when we met? Like 10 years ago. I said, no. And he said, well, you said, please pray for my husband. He's not Catholic, and I want him to become Catholic. And I said, wow, so you remembered that? And then he said, oh, yeah. So when I saw his name in the registration, it was like, all right, been praying a long time for this. So what was very sad, leaving St. Ignatius, ended up really having a silver lining, multiple silver linings, being at St. Margaret's. And Rich then, he did the program from 2022 to the Easter Vigil 2023, enabling him when Molly was married in July 2023 to receive communion. And I'm not going to lie, I kind of used that as a, like, there were certain points that he wanted to drop out because the schedule was tough for him with planning and all. And I said, well, you know, if you don't go through it, you're going to be sitting in the pew when Wilson and I get up to receive, along with Joe, who we loved, but he was our Jewish son-in-law. And so I think the idea of not being able to go up and receive was pretty impactful. So while I've been very blessed by my reinvigorated faith, I also thank God for allowing me to share that with others. For I think it was 5 years that we kept the Discovering Christ program going at St. Ignatius, and I became part of the coordinating team with Deb and Lee and Nancy and Ray Barzak, Barbara and George Deller, and Christina Calabrese. And I actually we had a daytime session and an evening session, and I was a table facilitator for both for those 5 years. I've been blessed through all of this to learn how to actually pray with people instead of just saying, oh yeah, I'll pray for you. And Mary Beth, you were huge in that. Deb, Mary Beth, Maria, Pam, Lisa Ross, Dan Evans, Michelle Kirby, Patty Amos, Jerry Bishop, all of you guys just taught me something I had never experienced before, like how to really pray with someone. And there's a woman that I met through Rich's RCIA whose daughter died during the program. Her daughter was her sponsor. And I just recently saw her. It was the 2-year anniversary of her daughter's death. And she was telling me, like, it's just, they were each other's best friend. She was only 19 when her daughter was born, and they did everything together. They lived close to each other. And I was able to pray with her that the tears were just flowing in the hug. And I was like, okay. And I'm thinking in my head, thank you, Mary Beth. It's really, and I've been able, through Father John Rumsa's prayers, Father Dan's prayers, Father Michael and Father Matt, other priests who've prayed with me and other church friends praying over, for, and with me, to release the unforgiveness that I was holding onto regarding some of the doctors involved in Molly's care, and some unforgiveness I had in some family situations. I was then able to help my mom in her faith. She went from calling me a religious fanatic when I would tune into EWTN or leave the house to go to daily mass, to telling me how much she enjoyed listening to Father John Riccardo, because after she was no longer able to drive, I was driving, including driving from her house to her beach house, which was a 3-hour-long drive, and I would find a Father John program that was the right time frame, and we would listen. She started coming with me to daily mass, and she went from absolutely, I mean, she was furious with me one morning when she left the room, and I changed the channel to EWTN. And she came down the hall, I so angry that it was ridiculous, and I was like, Mom, who is talking to me right now? Is this my mom or is this Satan? And after I said it, I was like, oh my God. But she stopped in her tracks, and we watched EWTN often. She went from that to her aides, one of whom is a beautiful Catholic woman from, now I forget where she's from, Trinidad. And we're still in touch. She texts me every single morning. She told me she heard my mom in the bedroom one day saying, Jesus, save my soul. Jesus, save my soul. And it was like, because she was a woman who never used the Lord's name except in vain for a long time. And that was something for years I had been like, Mom, unless you're praising him or thanking him, no. Which is uncomfortable to correct your mom, but she needed it. But she went from that to asking the aides to turn on EWTN for the morning mass. And then half an hour later was the daily mass that was televised from the cathedral that she was a member of. So she watched 2 masses a day. The only good thing about lockdowns, I would say, was all these other masses being televised, because we watched Father John Riccardo. We watched Father Isaac Makovo, who my mom had met. We watched Father Michael Rubling down in Severna Park, who Mom had met. His old roommate, who had been transferred from St. Agnes to another church further out east. We watched his masses. We watched a lot of masses while she was in bed dying. So yeah, because that was in 2020. She, nothing COVID related, but she, starting in May, was on home hospice care. And the 3 months I moved in with her up in New York, those 3 months were an amazing, beautiful grace. I asked her pastor, Father Bill, who is now known as Bishop Koenig in Wilmington, Delaware, to come to the house, and he did twice and anointed her. The priest who succeeded him as rector of the cathedral actually started, his first day on the job at St. Agnes was the day of Mom's funeral. And she died on a Tuesday. Starting Tuesday late afternoon, I was calling the church all the time to see who was scheduled for her funeral. And they finally had it scheduled, and it was Father Michael. And I said, Father Michael, who? And it was this lovely, lovely visiting priest who had been a missionary somewhere that COVID sent him out of that country, and he was residing at our parish. And I was like, oh, he'd be good, but it needs to be Father Michael Duffy, the new incoming rector. He's a young, dynamic, very, very beautiful priest. I had gotten to know him. He would say Saturday evening masses at the beach club my mom belonged to. He was at another parish then, but I had gotten to meet him then. I started emailing him, and I said, okay, I'm going to be like the persistent widow in Luke, but I'm going to keep asking till you say yes. I said, I know from my priest friends that weddings and funerals are the biggest places for evangelization. And I said, out of 10 of us, I'm the only one still practicing the Catholic faith. Like, you're the man for this job. And he said, all right, Mara, of course I'll do it. And it was beautiful. I then stayed at my mom's house for most of the next year after she died and was grateful to be at Mass, Adoration, and he started Advent and Lenten Vesper services, which were so beautiful. And he genuinely cared for us and about us. Every time he saw it, because Molly and Wilson were basically living with me most of that time too. And he would always, always ask us, how are you doing? Ever since Mom, like, how are you doing? How's the whole family doing? It was beautiful. Then 3 years later, Father Duffy celebrated Molly's wedding at St. Agnes. You can imagine my joy. I couldn't talk when Molly called me. She was back and forth all over the East Coast and out to Wisconsin, where Greg's family has a farm, as to where they would get married. And she finally called me. And because, when she told me that, then I'd start researching places in those different places and spend a ton of time. But she called me one day and she said, Mom, I should get married at St. Agnes, because then it'll feel like Grandma's there with me. And I couldn't talk. And she was like, Mom, you were there? And I was like, yes, I'm here. And then after the wedding, which really was exquisite, she planned everything beautifully. But she said to me after the wedding, Mom, out of everything and how beautiful and fun it all was, my absolute favorite part of the entire day was the Mass and Father Duffy's homily and blessing. I was like, okay, I lost one, but I got another one. As soon as they went back to in-class learning, I've moved up with my students from 4th grade to now they're in 6th grade. And Discovering Christ changed the way I am as a catechist. With Deacon Jim, I introduced the kids to adoration when they were in 4th grade. And remember, that was something I was completely unfamiliar with before Deb and Lee arranged it with the Discovering Christ program. We had only planned to do like 15 minutes because they were 4th graders who had never done it. And we were both really surprised when the kids were eager to stay longer. And that was a beautiful thing, because the next year we lost one of the students to brain cancer. And when she was not strong enough to come to class, she would go to adoration with Deacon Herman in the chapel by herself, because her mom was bringing her younger sister to faith formation, and Mackenzie would go to adoration. All that said, there's still some pretty significant challenges and crosses in my life, and I still hear my friend Dave Gossley, who I met at Discovering Christ in 2014, who would always say, when I would confide in him about what I was dealing with, he would say, shaking his head and smiling, God must really love you, really love you. And I was like, Dave, I got very close with him and his wife, kids, and granddaughter. And growing close, developing that friendship, at the same time my faith was deepening. I grew from feeling like more despondent than anything else to just feeling joy and really feeling loved by my friends who I met through the program and by Jesus. Dave called me in August 2020 when I was up at my mom's, and it was a Sunday afternoon, and we were just talking and laughing, and something made me say, Dave, I am so grateful to have you as a friend and for all you've done in my life. And he said, well, it's good to know I've done some good in this life. And I said, some good? I would say you kind of saved my life, and you've done so much for so many of us. When I saw his granddaughter calling me the next morning, I never thought it was going to be to say he had died. Yeah. So I thanked the Holy Spirit for putting on my heart that I needed to tell him how grateful I was for his friendship. So I often think about Dave saying that God must truly love me a lot. And I know it's true, even though it was hard to understand. I know he is true, and he cries along with me at the difficult times. And I know I can trust him. I often think about, it was Corrie ten Boom, who was a Nazi camp survivor, who often, it wasn't her poem, but it's associated with her because she often used it. Life is like a tapestry where God alone sees the beautiful finished product, while we only see the backside with its messy threads and frayed threads and knots. And it's not until we get to heaven that we'll see the finished tapestry and understand why we had the crosses we had and what beautiful things they brought about. So Michelle Kirby introduced me several years ago to the Surrender Novena, which is my go-to. Jesus, I surrender my life to you, take care of everything. And I do thank God ahead of time, as Father Solanus Casey taught, for what he has in store for me, my kids, my grandkids, and my siblings. And I just pray for the strength to be patient and trusting in the waiting, and to always be able to help others in some way to know the love of Jesus. That's about it. Thank you. What? Oh. Okay.
Okay. Anyone have something to ask?
Say no, say no.
I don't have anything to ask, but that was beautiful.
Thank you,
for
Terry.
sharing your journey.
Thank you. Thank
It's
you.
inspiring. It's inspiring.
Thank you.
And just a reminder, you have 4 children.
Three.
Three children.
My oldest will be 37 in May. Molly just turned 32, and Wilson is 27. 5 years apart, not by my design, but God's. There were miscarriages in between. So, but God knows what he's doing. I couldn't handle 5. So, but,
Wow.
yeah. And Wilson, I mean, he's on his own in Philadelphia, living with a friend who he met when they were babies in the strollers at their sister's practices. He doesn't go to the church that's right near him that he can walk to, but he prefers the Latin Mass and drives to that every Sunday.
Wow.
Yeah, yeah.
And where did you say Molly works?
She's at Lenox Hill Hospital in New York City, cardiology.
Such an amazing.
So her faith has given her strength, and it's because of everything she endured. Like, she's an old soul, but she had a teacher in high school, at a Catholic high school, who was atheist, excuse me, and he was tough.
What?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I had to complain to the school because he would park in the first parking spot that you would see when you dropped off, and he had some kind of something, a Darwin thing with the turtle eating the fish, yeah. And it was right there on the side of the car that everybody saw. And so I kind of made a stink and said, no, this is a Catholic school. That's not okay. But Delia had had him as a teacher and as a lacrosse coach, and she thought he was an excellent teacher, but he was kind of a bully, let's put it that way. And he was her lacrosse coach for a while, and he taught her a lot, but there were a lot of tears among a lot of the girls because he was not always a nice man. When Molly had him as a freshman, she came home one day saying, "Mom, you're never going to believe this. He was talking about, well, and then there's people who believe in God." And she stood up and she said, "Hello, I'm here to tell you that there is a God and that prayer is real and powerful. I wouldn't be standing here without people's prayers. And she proceeded to tell them, there were people praying all over the country. I didn't know most of them, and they're all praying for me. So no, there is a God. He is real. Prayer is real. She came home and told me that, and I was like, you realize you're probably going to fail this class, right? It was AP social studies of some sort. And she said, I don't care. He can't say that. Okay. She then brought Jesus into every single paper she had to write for that class. Every single one. And she did not fail. She got an A, like a high A. And each paper, he would circle, something and say, great reasoning. And so
Wow.
Father Steve recently, we were talking about that. And he said, I still pray for him. He said, when whether it was his father or mother was dying, he said, he did call me to come over to pray for her and anoint her. So keep praying for him. But yeah. So, and then being a physician assistant, she had a patient one day and it was just a mess. Miscommunication, understaffing. It was hideous. She arrived on a Sunday morning, pulled down the woman's sheet to put her stethoscope to find that her leg had been amputated, but she had been moved out of the recovery area with nobody addressing it. And she was bleeding like just crazy. That's why I say don't leave anybody alone in a hospital ever. And this is a top hospital. But it was like miscommunication, understaffing. So she sees that, she goes out in the hall, and she was like, Mom, I had to pull myself together so I didn't scream. It was horrific. And she then went back into the room and ordered blood transfusions for her. And the lab called her and said, well, we have to blood type her. And she said, no, you don't. That's why we have type O for emergencies. This is an emergency. She needs blood now. And then the attending doctor came in a little while later while the woman was being transfused, and he said, you ordered transfusions for a DNR patient? And she said, listen, this woman's probably going to die, but she's not dying today because of our mistakes, bleeding out like that. No, there are levels of palliative care, and that's what I ordered, and that's what she deserves. And I thought, oh, you're probably going to be fired. And instead, the woman's sister, who had been visiting her every single day, called finally, after the woman was stable. And she said, oh my goodness, I see I've missed a bunch of calls from you. Should I get there right away? I was on my way to church. And Molly said, okay, your sister is stable now, and church is where you should go right now. And then come, but she's stable now. It was a crisis. She's stable. And the woman played the organ at her church. Well, she came after church, and Molly and the doctor explained everything that was going on. Who knows how much they really explained, since there was a major lawsuit on their hands if they told the whole truth. But the woman hugged Molly and said, thank you. Thank you. Church is where I needed to be. And I was playing my organ for my sister and praying, and thank you. And then the doctor told Molly that I don't know if he apologized, but he told her that she was right, that the woman did need the transfusions and she shouldn't have gone out that way. She did end up dying within a week or two, but she was comfortable in that time. And her sister was able to be with her that whole time, knowing that the end was near. So, yeah. But, okay, sorry, I talked too much.
No, you're fine. I'm dizzy. I've got vertigo.